Okay.
He's an idiot. He's an absolute idiot.
What do you do?
I had to push it up the hill because, you know, I can't.
On this episode, we are back in La Plata and come bearing a metallic sacrifice for the S10 gods. No, just kidding, we're here to install the engine and transmission in the S10. While it's not unheard of for one person to install an engine single-handedly, this is definitely a 2 or 3 person task, so I've brought along Mike and Leah to assist in the installation. I think it is now safe to say that Mike is now a small block Chevy project expert, considering every vehicle in his current fleet is either equipped with a small block Chevy or LSX engine. So his contributions thus far, up to and including this episode, have been incredibly valuable to the advancement of this project. If you recognize him, you may have actually seen him before on his channel, Fuzzy Dice Projects, and I'll be sure to link him in the description as well as on a screen card thing. But without further ado, let's actually get started on the build here, and to start we will remove the original engine mounts, which are secured with 2 bolts and nuts, and of course GM put the nuts inside the frame holes, so to loosen the mounts we'll just pry on them like so, putting tension on that nut, allowing us to loosen the bolt. Now these new engine mounts are V8 swap specific and are secured with 3 bolts and 3 lock nuts, and of course they didn't include such hardware in the kit. So we'll go ahead and unload the engine hoist and engine, and I will make an emergency run to the local hardware store for the correct hardware. While in-camera Neil is making an emergency bolt run, the rest of us will indulge in a game of remove the other engine mount. And here comes Ryan, Carhartt Cowboy Boots Carwaggy to the rescue again. With the proper hardware acquired, we can go ahead and install the new engine mounts. And unlike the original mounts, these will be held with 3 bolts and 3 lock nuts. While still somewhat time consuming, the installation of the new mounts proved to be easier than removal of the old ones. With the stage set for some high performance eye candy, let's start the process of marrying the engine to the transmission. So we'll go and remove this engine stand to free up the rear bell housing bolt area, and grab the bolts from the other Vortec that I had handy in the garage. However, I discovered something very strange. While both the engine that we are dropping into the S10 and the other Vortec that I have on standby are nearly identical and came from the same model year Chevy trucks, the Vortec out of the van uses metric bolts and threads. And of course, since any store that sells bolts within the La Plata zip code closed at 5 p.m., we are now forced to scavenge for bolts within the barn. And what better place to check first than Mike's old 4.3 liter Chevy Blazer engine, which is basically a small block Chevy minus 2 cylinders, increasing the odds that it will bear the sacred fruit that is the 3/8 inch bolt.
It's maybe a touch short, but it's better than anything else. It's about 1.25 inches.
With our 6-cylinder sacrifice, we can begin the installation of the transmission bell housing on the engine. And because this transmission is so light, we can actually take the whole thing and install it in one piece. But it appears as though the input shaft does not want to play nicely with that pilot bearing. And after several attempts to try and get the engine and transmission To become best friends, we pulled everything apart and decided to try a new method. After checking and confirming that the clutch was still centered and that the transmission input shaft had the same number of splines as that centering tool, we loosened all of the transmission to bell housing bolts and then installed the bell housing to engine bolts, which secured everything together. We will then strategically tighten the bolts in a sort of three-dimensional star pattern to ensure that everything seats together evenly and to make sure that none of the ears on the transmission itself snap off, since they are made of aluminum. After the engine and transmission have hopefully been installed together correctly, we can turn the output shaft just to make sure that the crankshaft on the engine is turning properly. We will also try and actuate the clutch as best we can, just to make sure that the clutch fork isn't bound up on anything. With all that being done, we are very close to installing the engine into the vehicle, but we still need to install the engine side of those engine mounts, which luckily came with the correct hardware. If you've ever installed an engine, you know firsthand how tedious this task can be. Now throw in the fact that this engine was never offered in this vehicle from the factory, and things get even more confusing. The only thing we really have to reference where the engine should sit is the length of the transmission and the limitations of that engine mount kit. Further complicating this installation is the fact that the crossmember is not going to bolt directly to this tail shaft due to that 20-degree or so tilt that I mentioned in a previous video. So we will have to cut and re-weld that bracket to match the angle of the new tail shaft setup. But first we have to secure the engine to the engine mounts that are already bolted to the frame. And with that done, we can install the headers, and to do that we actually have to remove the steering shaft for the driver's side at least, since the steering shaft actually goes through the driver's side header. Installing the headers now will be somewhat important, as we can see where the exhaust collectors are going to end up, which will factor into the adjustment of the engine mounts and transmission crossmember. In order to more easily work on the crossmember modification, we'll place the S10 down on these rims that nobody would buy on Facebook Marketplace. Right now, the engine is only secured by 2 points, with the weight of the transmission putting a lot of strain on those rubber components. So what we're going to do here is install the drive shaft between the transmission and rear axle.
This could come out a little bit, I think.
Remove the spot in the crossmember that the transmission bolts to, and align the engine and transmission so that the drive shaft is centered using some rather unconventional methods. It is important to center the transmission as much as possible, since the shifter will come through the floor in the middle of the transmission tunnel, and it is also important that the drive shaft is as centered as possible, as to reduce any unnecessary wear in the universal joints of that drive shaft, as well as to keep the drive shaft from colliding with anything else underneath the truck. With the engine positioned in a way that centers the drive shaft down the middle of the truck, we can take that bracket we cut off earlier and re-weld it to the crossmember in a way that the transmission can bolt to it. And in this video, we're just going to tack it in place fairly well, and then remove the crossmember from the vehicle again and more thoroughly weld it in place and clean it up a little bit, so if someone climbs underneath, it won't look like Ray Charles did the welding. With the engine and transmission now secured to the frame, we can test the fitment of several T5 shifters to ensure that the tilt of the tail shaft is not going to interfere with shifting ergonomics. And after some time playing with the factory S10 floor shifter, the Camaro shifter and some tall shifter I found in the junkyard, I have concluded that the Camaro shifter is probably going to be the best fit for this application, which is more of a coincidence because if you watch the video on the tail shaft swap, on the Camaro tail shaft there will be no tilt. And the reason we can't use the Camaro tail shaft is because the shifter would be back towards where the bench seat is, which is also illustrated in that video. Now that the entire drivetrain is essentially bolted to the truck, we can give it a quick test start and see if it still runs.
Gasoline will be over here.
I'm going to crank it a little bit just to make sure any fumes get sucked in, and then I'm going to add ignition. I wonder if our timing's off. Yeah. Timing is not correct. That's bad. Still kicking.
With several attempts at starting the engine, it's clear there's an issue with air, fuel, or spark, but it's kind of difficult to narrow down which one when your fuel delivery system does not have a fuel regulator and the fuel you are using has been sitting for some time. And that right there might be the problem. But we were also experiencing this weird kickback where the ignition timing appeared to be too early. With a number of things still left to be done, I think this is a good stopping point for this video. So we'll come back and address the fuel delivery system in the next video, since we will begin working on some of the electrical wiring while installing the Phytech system as well as some of the fuel lines.